It was supposed to be a new axis of allies capable of challenging Western dominance. A collective of countries, all influenced by Russia, that Vladimir Putin could use to strengthen his threats against the West and jostle for what he sees as his rightful place at the head of the geopolitical table. Through carefully chosen alliances, Putin thought that he was slowly maneuvering himself into a position that would see Russia become the world's most dominant nation. Putin was wrong. Russia's leader has just endured a week from hell that has seen his allies drop like flies. First, it was Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Next up, Iran. The Iranian regime is collapsing as the country descends into chaos amidst massive protests. For over a week, Iran's regime has been forced to absorb a wave of protests sparked by anger over the country's failing economy, and it doesn't look like those protests are going to end anytime soon. According to the BBC, human rights activists claim that protests took place in 26 of Iran's 31 provinces during the week leading up to January 5th alone, and Iran hasn't been able to do much of anything to quell the mass outrage. Unfortunately, 19 protesters have died. However, this is far from the type of brutal put-down that the country's regime would have to carry out to forcibly silence its own people. These protests began on December 28th, as Iranian shopkeepers flooded the streets of Tehran against the backdrop of the Iranian rial falling sharply in value against the US dollar. That currency has plunged to record lows, and it has done so at a time when inflation in Iran has risen as high as 40%, while sanctions implemented to halt Iran's nuclear program bite hard. Food inflation is higher, having hit 70%. And the BBC says that the cost of other basic goods has rocketed up by as much as 110%. Soon after the shopkeepers took to the streets, university students and other anti-regime people joined them. The crowds chant slogans such as "Death to the Dictator," with these pointed words being aimed squarely at the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei. These protests have shaken the Iranian regime to its very core, and that shaking is developing into a seismic event that has hit Khamenei and his cronies at a point when the country they lead is at the weakest it has been in several years. Corruption is also a major issue, as the BBC reports. High-profile corruption cases in Iranian courts involving senior officials and their families have reinforced public anger and the belief that parts of the ruling elite are exploiting the crisis, the outlet says. To the average Iranian, there seems to be a sense that some high-ranking officials are using sanctions to secure special deals that allow them to control imports, exports, and oil movements in what amounts to a form of money laundering that enriches those at the top while the average Iranian struggles. All of these pressures have been building for a long time. Now, they've exploded in protests that threaten Khamenei's entire regime. This is far from the first time that the Iranian people have protested against their leaders. As Al Jazeera points out in a January 5th report, protests were rife following the Iranian Revolution, leading to thousands of people marching on the streets between 1979 all of the way up to the late 1990s. Student and reformist protests took place in 1999 and into the early 2000s, which were then followed by protests by Iran's Green Movement in 2009 and 2010. The Mahsa Amini uprising, which began in 2022, sparked another wave of protests as infuriated Iranians voiced their anger about the death of Amini when she was in police custody. However, what we're seeing now, which are the worst protests since the Amini uprising, seem to be different. Some of the faces in the crowds may be the same as those seen in years past, but Iran's regime no longer seems to have the power to shut down the people who are trying to rid themselves of Khamenei. Uprisings that have, in the past, led to the deaths of hundreds and the arrests of many thousands more are now happening largely unabated. The big question is, why? Iran International offered some potential answers in a January 2nd report, in which it highlighted how several experts believe that the protests have exposed a regime that is sliding toward a collapse. The outlet says that some of these experts believe that these protests will spark the slow erosion of the Khamenei regime's ability to govern. which will inevitably lead to the destruction of the entire system that Iran's supreme leader has built around himself. The trigger for that collapse will be the economic problems we've already covered. Danny Sutrinovich, who is the former head of the Iran branch of Israel's military intelligence, says that the Khamenei regime is hamstrung by its inability to find a way out of these economic woes. The main problem the regime has is that it has no silver bullet solution to the economic problems in Iran, Sutrinovich says. Any temporary fix implemented won't do much, as the problem will stay, the intelligence expert claims. Another expert, Alex Vatanka of the Middle East Institute, adds that the mood among Iran's elites also indicates that they don't have the appetite or capability to deal with what's happening on the streets. I have certainly not ever seen this level of hopelessness inside the Iranian regime, Vatanka says. Such hopelessness may propel Iran even closer to regime change as the country's elites start jostling among themselves to settle internal rivalries, perhaps leading to mistakes that add further fuel to an already raging fire. A January 4th opinion piece by the Jerusalem Post's Daniel M. Rosen adds that Iran's regime has more than the country's economy to worry about. It says that the core ideological anchor that holds that regime in place is gone, and with it has followed the popular base and perhaps even the support of the Iranian military. This moment is akin to a false prophet whose promises of salvation have been proven empty. The Islamic Republic's government long justifies the extraordinary sacrifices demanded of its citizens, the blood and the economic hardship as contributions to a higher purpose, the advancement of Islamist ideology capable of destroying Israel and challenging the West, Rosen says. The problem? All of the sacrifices that Khamenei's regime asked for haven't been repaid. Iran is no more a challenger to the West than it was years ago. If anything, it is weaker, as demonstrated by both the country's economic hardships and Iran's utter failure to defend itself against joint Israeli and U.S. airstrikes in 2025, time and time again. The outlet argues the Khamenei regime has proven its own claims fraudulent. Massive inflation may just be the straw that broke the back of a camel that was already buckling under the weight of false promises. But perhaps the biggest killer of any hope that Iran's regime has of a turnaround is that there appears to be no resolution for the economic issues that provoke the unrest we now see. At least, that seems to be the collective opinion of those taking to the streets. That's according to University of Central Florida PhD student in political science Khosrow Karadagi. Speaking to DW, he says, in such a setting, when living costs rise, but incomes and job security don't keep pace, livelihood grievances quickly turn into dissatisfaction. This economic crisis is unfolding in a context where public trust in the government's ability to control inflation and create stability has eroded. Broken trust is what it all boils down to. Khamenei has managed to avoid overthrow in the past, despite his regime's many broken promises. But combine corruption with military weakness with economic pressures, and you get a series of broken promises in quick succession that have resulted in the patience of the Iranian people disappearing. Still, even with all of these issues, Iran's regime should still be able to do something. Even if that something is cracking down on the protests with such force that they're destroyed, that would at least buy time and perhaps give Khamenei the ability to intimidate the Iranian people into submission. Only that isn't an option either. And the reason why is that U.S. President Donald Trump has made it very clear that the U.S. will respond if Iran's regime attempts to shut these protests down with violence. Just a day after the military operation that saw the U.S. oust Maduro from Venezuela, Trump spoke about what's happening in Iran, and in doing so, he delivered a warning that has severely limited the Khamenei regime's options. We're watching it very closely. If they start killing people like they have in the past, I think they're going to get hit very hard by the United States, Trump told reporters. And Iran's regime knows that the U.S. president is likely serious. Trump has already ordered an airstrike against Iran once before during his second stint in office, so any hint that he would do so again has to be taken seriously by those trying to defuse the situation in Iran. What does that leave Iran with? Very few options and a bunch of solutions that are laughable at best. In its report on the Iran protests, Reuters says that the combination of the economic crisis plaguing Iran and Trump, having previously proven that he will follow through on his threats against the nation, has left the Khamenei regime with no cards. As one unnamed Iranian official tells the outlet, these twin pressures have narrowed Tehran's room for maneuver, leaving leaders caught between public anger on the streets and hardening demands and threats from Washington, with few viable options and high risks on every path. Still, Iran searches for solutions. One of the things the Khamenei regime has proposed is an economic relief package that will be put in place on January 10th. You might think that this package would offer the protest